So if there are 50,000 Southern Baptist churches out there, there are about 500 that are in that top 1%. Those are the churches that we're working with. And as we walk alongside of them, what we found around this learning community space, there's an incredible amount of value in getting churches that multiply, churches that make disciples. If we get you all together, you guys can learn from each other and solve each other's problems. Whether you guys know it or not, Keystone has been really instrumental in that process. From what you guys have done at DMAC to the amount of churches that you've already sent out within this 10-year trajectory for you guys as a church. You guys are doing some really significant things.
Welcome to Keystone Conversations, our podcast on the topics and issues important to the Keystone family. Our hope is to give insight, wisdom, and resources as you press on to know and follow Jesus. Today we have a great opportunity with a special guest, but first, my partner in crime, as always, lead pastor Brent.
Hey Randy, how are we?
And our special guest, Mr. Brian Frye.
Randy, how you doing today, man?
I am doing awesome because This is one of the good times I probably will talk the least.
This is good. This is
going to be great.
Yeah, you kind of got roped into two talkers here.
I love it. This is awesome. This will be
Wonderful.
no problem. If we have propagating content here, we're definitely doing something wrong. But Brian's the director of multiplying churches and networks with the Ascended Network. That's part of the North American Mission Board. And our focus entirely today will be on church planting and church multiplication. It's so much important part of Keystone's DNA for what we're doing. And Brian, you're going to just speak into that so much for our people, but you're going to give it a little different perspective than what maybe many of our people are more familiar with. They're definitely familiar with the collegiate experience, our work with the SALT Network. But why don't you just kick us off and tell us a little bit about the Send Network? Give us a lay version of what that does and how you got there, and start there.
Yeah, man, just a little bit of background. So the Send Network is the church planting arm of the North American Mission Board. Okay. So we serve Southern Baptist churches around North America to help engage them in church planting. Mm-hmm. We don't do the church planting side. That's you guys who do it. This church is local folks who are out in the trenches. You guys are making disciples. You're leading people to Jesus. And our job is to help you guys just do what you do faster, better, stronger. So if there are 50,000 churches out there, my role, my functionality is to work with the 500 or so that are our highest capacity or our highest productivity churches. And of course, Keystone is one of those.
All right.
I don't know if you knew that.
Love it.
But you guys are one.
We'll take it.
And in fact, Brian, the reason we get this opportunity today is Brian is here with his team helping one of those multiplying community or churches, meeting together, having a learning context for that, which is so good. But there's something you said there that I think I want to just stress in because Brent said a lot too. Churches plant churches.
Absolutely.
Networks don't plant churches. And that's just something we always like to stress.
Yeah, man, absolutely. So to answer the question you were asking a little bit earlier, so if there are 50,000 Southern Baptist churches out there, there are about 500 that are in that top 1%. Those are the churches that we're working with. And as we walk alongside of them, what we found around this learning community space is if you're really effective at planting church, you plant a lot of churches. It's not that somebody's going to come in and teach you a lot of new stuff. Like you've already kind of figured that out. But there's an incredible amount of value in getting churches that multiply, churches that make disciples, churches that raise leaders, that start new churches in new places, or start new sites for some who do multi-site. If we get you all together, you guys can learn from each other and solve each other's problems. So whether you guys know it or not, Keystone has been really instrumental in that process. From what you guys have done at DMAC to the amount of churches that you've already sent out within this 10-year trajectory for you guys as a church. You guys are doing some really significant things.
Well, that's a good insight because, Brent, as you've seen, and you've worked with these guys longer, is that obviously we know the collegiate side, but what we're being exposed to is churches that plant in a multi-site context, an ethnic context. There's a variety of rationale of where churches are needed. Even from sizing, macro, micro, that's what we're trying to partner with.
Yeah, and I think it's really, for the folks at Keystone, they have seen the announcement videos. They've seen, hey, we're going to Bowling Green to Western Kentucky. Would you consider going? Illinois State, even though those who've been around longer, Michigan State, they see those and they see the church planters come. What they probably haven't understood is the great partner that Send is with us because there's a level of like assessment that they do, some of the funding that they can be able to do that allows us to do what we do. It's such a blessing to us because it takes a lot of infrastructure, a lot of shared knowledge to pull all those church plants off. And Send has been such an incredible partner with us. And so now, as we're kind of in this learning community, it's great because it's what we're trying to do is get around other churches who do what we do. And there's I mean, it's just people who have been in the trenches, you learn some things, and it's just really helpful to be around those folks, and we can learn from each other.
So, Brent, talk to us more, especially for the Keystone to know, in terms of how we partner with Brian. What does that look like? That could be a lot of things.
Yeah.
There's some things it is, some things there isn't. But in terms of how us working together is so much more powerful than maybe us working apart.
I think it's really important to say this, that Send is a really big partner with Salt Network at large, and that's kind of the way we engage Send Network. I mean, we give financially to the cooperative program, as it were, for you real nerds about how this works.
For those who know that language,
Yeah,
man,
yeah.
the CP
For those that know
folks.
that,
Yeah.
So we give financially every year. It would, in our budget, if you see our budget, it's going to say BCI, toward Baptist Convention of Iowa. So we give through that level. So we partner financially because not only here, but also International Mission Board, some of the seminaries, there's a lot of great things that happen with that. But then there's support financially that as we plant churches. Send Network helps give some seed money because not every church can fully fund. We also, one of the great things that Send does for us is assessments. A lot of people are like, hey, how do you know a planter? It's like, we have a 2-year process with way more than NAM would require because we want our planters to be at a really high certain level. But none of our planters are going to be fully sent out until they go through the assessment. I mean, Brian, we could probably talk about that for a while, but I mean, it's looking at their finances, their marriage, their theology, their capacities, like just straight up capabilities of how well do you preach? I mean, it is in-depth, multi-month process.
Yeah, and I mean from the start of engagement all the way through year 5, Send Network is walking alongside the planter and the church planter's spouse and the team in a lot of ways to help them be successful in the process. So
the hundreds, if not thousands, of steps it takes until you actually open that new church plant. And these are the guys behind helping every step of the way to the church to do that well.
And man, what's so great about you guys as Keystone is a lot of churches, they don't engage in planting. They've never engaged in planting before. So the fact that the idea of church planting, of making disciples, of raising up, sending out leaders, it's normative for you guys. That's a really significant thing. So what's normal for you guys is really, man, it's exemplary for other churches. And that's a special thing that you guys are building. And I think part of the process of us walking alongside of you all is in ways we have not called that out of you, but when you've said, hey, we want to do this, this is where we get the opportunity to walk alongside Keystone and other churches like you all.
Yeah. Well, that's great. As you see, and you see a lot more of the nation than we do. We obviously are focused on ours. If you can take a step back and say, hey, what are the 1 or 2 things that just excites you as you wake up every morning, you're dealing with churches, dealing with multiplication, what's just energizing and exciting to you in that context as you look across the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, actually, there are a lot. I know that may surprise people, but there are so many good things that are going on. Man, I think in the past, we would talk about church planting, and the concept of church planting was for those who couldn't lead a normal church, a successful church. It's for the weird guys or for the guys who are too entrepreneurial, or the youth ministers who were going a little bit crazy.
The consolation prize.
That's it.
Yeah.
But, man,
For a while it was the youth pastor who was so sick of their lead
we
pastor.
can't have him be in here.
Yeah.
This guy's a little bit crazy. But church planting, as a discipline, as a body of work, it's becoming more normal, and we have needed that for a long time. It's no longer this thing that only the fringe folks do. It's becoming core to who we are. That is a beautiful thing for us. So that's a piece. I think increasingly there's a desire to dial in towards niches or towards affinities within the North American population. So we talk about university context planning, what Saul has done. That is an affinity. Military church planting in or around bases, man, that is on the rise. The different ethnic groups targeting or focusing towards ethnic groups, man, that's on the rise. So not only has church planting become this centralized, valued thing, the esteem has gone up, but the desire to reach the different populations and trying to figure out who are the people that we are aligned as a congregation, that we're aligned as a church to reach, who are those folks? Those questions are getting asked. So super excited. And I mean, I think the last thing is there feels like there's a drumbeat of collaboration that is emerging, and that is unique. And I think that has to be attributed to God, because most people, they're not going to give away their folks. They're not going to encourage people, 34 folks from their congregation to move to Western Kentucky. Like there's just things going on collaboratively, not just within Salt Tribe, but in the broader church planting tribes. People are giving away their stuff. People are saying, hey, man, how can I help you grow and get stronger? And that's a beautiful thing and a much needed thing over time.
So exciting with that. And Brian, as you've worked with Brian and Send, how have you been challenged? And I'm not saying challenged as a negative. I'm saying just the breadth of the opportunity, the depth of it in terms of how we incorporate here at Keystone. What are some of the things you've even taken away or seen? And that you're such a visionary, you're such an entrepreneur. I know these things bring ideas to your mind left and right.
I mean, I think what Brian said is pretty somewhat accurate in that it's on the books. Unless something happens, our intention and conviction, we feel like a calling from God is to plant a collegiate church every 3 years. Like we have built systems and structures and budgets and all the things to make sure that that can happen. And praise God for what's God's doing there. I think it also, he's saying there's all sorts of niches and he's saying all the positive stuff, but you can't look at the religious activity or the gospel need of our country and not be alarmed.
Oh, totally.
So he's saying the good things, that's the right steps we're making. But I would just say, if you look at the gospel need in Des Moines, in the Midwest, like it's astounding. And I think if you're a Chicken Little type of a person, you could want to say, oh my gosh, it's all going to end. And I'm not a Chicken Little person. You know that, Randy.
That's right.
I'm like, listen, we
go.
serve a big God, and he's called us to big things. And we're in 1 Thessalonians. My dudes had 3 weeks of the gospel, and they turned the world upside down, Acts 17 says. They are now making waves through all Macedonia and Achaia. So I'm not okay. I mean, man, we couldn't love our collegiate stance anymore. But we have to think, I mean, I think that even Brian will also, punch me in the ribs every now and again and say, there's other things that need to be done. And, as elders, we're open to that. God, we have one life.
That's right.
We have the calling of this church isn't a new building. That's a fact. It is a kingdom expansive reality. And so what are we to do in this season? So it helps me keep my eyes open to God, what else do you want us to do?
That's good.
Because again, back to a prayer that we pray all the time. The fields are wide into harvest. That needs to be said way more. I could get on a soapbox here, Randy, and I'm not going to, but the fields are white.
That's right.
We need to be moving into the harvest.
That's right. It's such a good reminder. And you mentioned that as an obstacle opportunity, right? The harvest is there. And Brian, as you look out, just an additional side of that, we've talked about the positive sides. What are some of the biggest obstacles you're facing? Some of the concerns? Could it be people? Could it be funding? What are you seeing that is some you have to overcome?
Yeah, I think as we look at the broader picture, we could look at currents within our country, within the society, and say, oh, bad, 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 bad. In that Chicken Little mindset, man, you could get in, we could all be in that space. Yeah. But the reality is you look back in history and when the pressures have grown most on the church, when things aren't set to our favor, man, that's typically, that's where the church thrives, which grows the most. So, man, we could talk about there's a tsunami of closures of churches happening all across North America. A lot of the multipliers, the high capacity churches that we work with, they will talk about people calling them weekly saying, hey man, we'd like to be a part of your congregation. We're closing our congregation. We need, we don't know what to do with our assets, our building, our property. Yep. So man, that's a negative pressure that's coming. I think in the university context, we're seeing increasingly that those who are teaching and leading are more and more anti-gospel, anti what we believe in faith-wise. So we could talk about the governmental pressures and those types of things. But at the end of the day, I think the most significant ones are, hey man, we got to plant a lot more churches and we've got to raise up disciples faster, which means, man, we've got to be living out the gospel more.
So let's talk about this because one time I had a brother said, why are we planting churches? That does not make sense to me. I mean, I'm leading you because I want to
bet.
say what you're going to
bet.
say.
You
But
bet.
why do we need to plant churches? We have churches closing.
Yeah.
Why are we starting new churches? Help me, give me a reason for that.
Yeah, I think when people think about churches in general, they think about this permanent fixture that's going to be there forever.
Yeah.
But the reality is that every church that starts, it's like a human being. It's born, it reaches maturation, and it dies.
You cannot go to Ephesus today. You can go there. There ain't no building.
That's right.
You can't. You don't see it. So if we think about churches and we think about churches being analogous to people, a church is a group of people who are living on life doing mission together, or should be. That church is going to have a start date and it's going to have a life cycle and it's going to go away.
Yeah.
So for us to look at churches and say, oh, man, we've got enough, we've got plateaued, it would be like looking at a population of a city and saying, hey, no more kids here.
Yep.
We've got enough already. That church, that community, they'll go away if it's not there. So if we really believe that we're trying to reach people in North America, we need to understand that churches have a life cycle. They don't last, which necessitates the starting and planting of more churches. So,
And I think of two things as well. Is I can't quote the study or the statistic, but basically, the vast majority of baptized people come from new churches
absolutely.
because there's an evangelistic pressure. Pressure is maybe the wrong word, but there's an evangelistic fervor, and there's if you're planting a church. I don't know a church planter who wakes up and says, I can't wait for another church down the street to shut down, and they all come to me. They all actually panic when that happens.
Right.
They actually are trying to do everything they can to reach people for Christ. But secondly, you look at a city like Ankeny, and probably 7 years ago, our elder said, we don't want to be multi-site in Ankeny. It's small enough that we can be one church for Ankeny. Because that was an option when we went to build this building. But the reality is if you do demographic studies, Ankeny in Iowa is growing like crazy. And there's 15, 20,000 more people than when I moved here.
Yeah.
And if the church is not going to lose ground, we must plant churches for population increases alone. Right. So there's churches, almost all the church planters that come to town, are good gospel folks. And so they call and should we plant another church? And I'm like, please.
Please do.
Please. There is no territorial wars in this city. There's just a growing population that needs to hear the gospel. So I think of just the evangelistic fervor.
Oh, man.
And then also just population change is real. And especially the places that we're planting churches, most of those populations are growing. And for us at a collegiate level where we plant, there's a crop of 2,000 to 5,000 students every fall. Every fall.
DMAC, you guys.
And I think that's a good point. It's actually being responsive to do that, because if you think about it, demographics will move faster than we can.
Yeah.
Right? You can talk about rural churches now versus exurb versus suburb versus city churches, and that's going to continue to shift outside our control.
Yeah.
What we have to do is be responsive to where people are at, where the harvest is at, and continue to say, hey, what's the best way? What's the best strategy? Reaching Ankeny 10 years ago looks a lot different than reaching Ankeny now.
It
and that
really
was a microcosm.
Yeah.
And you think of these other places where it's been so much longer there.
We talk about the external value. So we're leading people to Jesus who did not know Jesus before. So new units of churches in new places, that creates an instant value add to that community as there's a gospel outpost in that new space. So whether you add 40 more churches in Ankeny or other people come in and plant, but the process, you're creating more places for people to have connectivity to the gospel. At the same time, internally, the benefit to you guys at Keystone is every time you plant, you send people out, it creates a vacuum. It creates more spaces. And if you're going to continue to grow as a church and be healthy and vibrant, you need to continue to share the gospel more and draw people in. So it creates this, planting creates a virtuous cycle for the benefit of believers, but then also for everybody outside of the congregation who you guys get to interact with on a daily basis.
Brian, I cannot, the internal panic I have when we send people.
What does it feel like when you see chunks of your congregation go?
And staff.
And leads,
So
and finances, if we're being
joyful
candid.
disorientation.
Yeah. Joyful disorientation. I mean, we're talking shop now, but, whenever people have committed to a church plant, and it's going to start in September, we begin to encourage them to give to that church plant beginning in January. So every January, when we're planting a church, people are going to stop giving to Keystone. That's the income side of the equation, not the expense side of the equation.
Yep.
You bet.
Which is just, we plant, I don't like this. We plant churches with a lot of resources, a lot of staff. That is frowned upon in some places, but we have a track record of being able to use that amount of staff and pretty quickly get it up and running at a level that is helpful. But I mean, here's what I say. Leaders leave. When you say, hey, move across the country for the gospel, it's not the people who are sitting on the back row that's going. It's people who know how to that have an evangelistic fervor, it really is a panic. I mean, our volunteer teams usually get decimated. But I actually think exactly what you say, that's the fear.
Yep.
And that is real. Like, we have a rule with all of our church planters. No one's off limits.
When you say that, you're saying anybody in the congregation,
Anybody on staff, an elder,
invite to go and convince to go plant with them. You're
Have a
okay with them.
conversation.
my rules with them is if you're a big enough old boy to call someone to that vision, you get them.
Okay.
No one's off limits.
So anybody listening to this podcast today, if they get an ask, you expect them to entertain that ask.
Yeah.
Okay.
We say it on the stage all the time.
Absolutely.
But we don't, but
That's one of the things we put our money where our mouth is.
That's
Most traction is because it's not the best thing for us.
Yeah.
In terms of, because it brings in risk and it brings in renewal, it brings in more leaders, it brings in more volunteers. It actually, it's the farming and gardening metaphor.
I think it's
to go on
actually,
there.
it's an example of, Lord, I'm going to trust what you say. I'm not going to live by what I want. Because, my gosh, if Paul can leave, Timothy in Ephesus, and then, like we're in Thessalonians, we're talking about Thessalonians, Brian. Like, he's like, hey, Timothy was with me, but I'm going to send him back to you because I got to make sure you're okay. And this is Timothy, who's the pastor of Ephesus.
Right.
And so either we get, like, one of our values, we give like it all belongs to God. And I think that's an example of how we can not require generosity from people, but as a church, we can demonstrate generosity. And that is finances we plant the church, but it's also open-handedness.
So, Brian, some final thoughts for our Keystone family as you've visited churches, and you get the unique, you have the network level, you have the church level. If I'm sitting in a seat on a Sunday and I'm all in for this vision, how best can I pray about it, think about it, encourage that? How best can I get connected to what either we're trying to do here at Keystone or what you're trying to do at the Send Network?
Yeah. So, I mean, the very first thing for anybody is just awareness. Like, if we've talked about something today in the podcast, if there's something that Brent said, a passage of scripture that you're like, okay, what does he mean when he's talking about Timothy in this way? Like, just continue to grow in your awareness and learning. That's, I think, one of the best parts about Keystone, and there are a lot of best parts. I know I've highlighted those today, but you guys are this sacrificial organization and you're this learning organization all at the same time. So my encouragement to everybody listening in, man, be a learner, like learn about what's going on. And the second thing is, man, as these guys give you opportunity, as Keystone presents opportunities, whether it's going down to Bowling Green, Kentucky on a mission trip, or going overseas, or getting involved in something locally, like, grow your awareness, grow your learning, and then take opportunities. Man, anything that you guys are pushing their way, you've vetted, you've thought it through, you know that it's in alignment with the body. So, man, just don't warm the bench, get in the game. Get in the game.
That's a great word. That's going to be the last word. That's awesome. Can't think of a better charge than that. Thanks so much for being part of the conversation today. If you'd like to know more about Keystone in general, hear a sermon, or listen to more conversations, please visit keystonelife.com. We'll also put the Send Network link in our show notes to follow them to see what the Send Network is doing as well. But until next time, keep the conversation going.